Often when someone asks you, who are you? One of the first things you might say in response is to answer another related question. Where are you from? The question of identity is often tied to place, and more particularly one's nation, the land where one's born. What begins as an individual question based on the I imperceptibly blurs into a social one, referring to the places that we come from, revealing that our identities are innately social. We cannot escape this fact, since identity just is a way of marking out difference, discriminating between I and you, us and them. One consequence of our identities being socially constructed in this way is that they are not only multiple, but fluid and dynamic, not solid and static. This may sound like some radical sociological theory to certain types of people, but all I mean is that how you experience, say, being male, white European, age 30, depends on your social context, who you interact with and who you encounter. Admittedly, there's a lot about identities that might remain fairly constant. For instance, the fact that I'm a New Zealander, and more particularly someone from Indian and English ancestry, is not something that I can really change. For even if I were to change my citizenship, I'd technically be an expatriate, since my patria, or fatherland, is Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I will always be by virtue of my parents or parents' families immigrating to the land of the long white cloud in the South Pacific, a particular kind of New Zealander, one who was raised in a bicultural home by a Pākehā Christian father and an Indo-Fijian Hindu-turned Christian mother. Yet, despite the fact that Indo-European or Indo-English New Zealander has remained, and probably will remain, as an identity marker for me internally, it has not always been so externally. I have occasionally suppressed or marginalized my mother's Indo-Fijian ethnicity in filling out identity forms or in casual conversations with certain other people. Not typically because I am ashamed or afraid of expressing it, but because I have either rationalized it as not overly relevant to note in the situation, or assented to the assimilating effects of the dominant Pākehā culture by speaking and acting like a white New Zealand European. It's not just in physical places, but in digital places too. Like, for instance, it was only fairly recently that I made the conscious decision to identify first as an Indo-English New Zealander on social media. And even here, this had at least as much to do with realizing that many of the people I interact with or follow on social media are from outside New Zealand, as it had to do with an actual personal attempt to reclaim my cultural identities. All of which is just to illustrate the fluidity and dynamism of just one of my identities, namely ethnic or cultural. Of course, I have multiple others, which are distinct but difficult to neatly separate since they are all me. I could also talk about, say, my gender or my age, but since these are aspects to myself which don't overly define my identity personally and interpersonally, I won't bother to mention them here, and we'll let you guess yourselves. Instead, I want to make another general point that follows from the social multiple nature of ourselves, which is that different aspects of ourselves are both formed by and reflected in how we interact with each other in different communities. What exactly a community is a vexed question. Like, is it just any group of people with a common interest or shared identity? Or must all members be mutually concerned for each other and not systemically exploit one another? Whatever the case, we all can recognize one in practice because we all speak of many different kinds of communities, international, global, national, local or neighborhood, religious communities, digital communities. And as with our identities, they are difficult to neatly separate. So, for instance, I consider myself to be an eco-socialist, a term I'll expand upon later. But even etymologically speaking, it's a term that is manifestly global because it conjoins eco, as in ecology, the study of living organisms' relationship with their oikos or home environment, with the word socialist, which is a tradition that has always been democratically internationalist, as represented in the rallying cry in the Communist Manifesto, translated popularly into English as "Workers of the world unite," but in the original German it says "Proletarians of all countries unite." But anyway, so I therefore see myself as a part of a radically politically left international community of people who desire to see and work towards realizing a world beyond the dominating influence of a capitalist system that has wreaked havoc globally, increasingly and rapidly making this planet uninhabitable for both human and non-human life. But this is not only international community I see myself to be a part of. I'm also a part of an international community of Christians, and in particular Protestants, and even more specifically, Baptists. Moreover, my Christian identity overlaps with my aforementioned political identity, such that I am a Christian socialist, or even more provocatively, though not inaccurately, Christian communist. Now, I realize that Baptist Christian in combination with communist might sound a bit jarring to many American ears, though I do personally know a few people who identify in such a way. So that's where noting that I am part of a Baptist church in central Auckland, which is, as all churches should be, radically inclusive of all kinds of people, might help. For one, we New Zealand Baptists have never really cared about identifying as, well, Baptist. In fact, some years ago, a church life survey found that among all the Christian traditions in New Zealand, Baptists have the lowest sense of denominational identity. So most people in our churches don't actually see themselves as Baptists. Politically, that's because we're loosely held together in the first place, each congregation functioning more or less autonomously. But we're also not defined overly by creeds or doctrines, though this does not mean we don't have creeds or doctrines. Most of us do, in fact. It's just that we're not often attracted to a local church community, primarily for these reasons. Like, according to that aforementioned church life survey, what attracts most of us is worship. So there's a high level of appreciation of music and singing as means by which the congregation encounters Christ. Speaking for myself, it's certainly what kept me there as a musician who used to regularly sing and play piano in church services. You can't see any videos of this, but you'll notice that the previous videos on this channel are mainly my piano videos, if anyone's interested. Now, I might say a little bit more about us Baptists in later videos. I only mention us briefly to illustrate how I can call myself a part of the Christian community, which has sadly been notoriously reactionary towards liberatory movements and oppressive of marginal groups. And that is because my national and more specifically local community not only tolerates but openly embraces my ambiguous relationship to the Christian religion. But what do I mean by ambiguous relationship to Christianity? So just as it's useful to qualify or hyphenate my politics with the eco prefix, it's also probably useful to qualify my religious identity by adding certain adjectives or adverbs. One that I've been using recently, which I like partly because it's somewhat obscure but not wholly unintelligible to certain philosophers, is based on an archaic word, zetetic. Zetetic is both a noun and an adjective. One can be a zetetic and zetetic about something. The latter makes more sense to most English speakers, though. Like, to be zetetic means to proceed by zetesis, which is the Greek word for inquiry. So someone who so likes to proceed by inquiry or investigation that it becomes an essential part of their identity, you could call them a zetetic, or to use a similar word more familiar to English speakers, a skeptic. Because etymologically, after all, skeptic and zetetic mean almost the same thing. Someone who looks at or inspects someone or someone. And zetetic was also a word used in antiquity to describe Pyrrhonists, who were a group of ancient Greek skeptics. But I use it in the sense close to that of the late sociologist Marcello Truzzi, who was the founding co-chairman of the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, which had a journal later renamed the Zetetic. Truzzi, who is credited with the off-sided skeptics line, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, promoted the term zeteticism as an alternative to skepticism, because he thought that the latter term was being appropriated by those he termed pseudo-skeptics, that is, those who did not in fact investigate a claim before judging a paranormal claim to be false, but created the facade that they had done so. But my usage of the word zeteticism isn't as narrow as this. I mean it more in the sense of the Norwegian philosopher who coined the term deep ecology, Arne Næss, who used it to refer to a particular attitude towards knowledge. Or more recently, the way in which the scholar of religion and social sciences, Josephson Storm, uses it in his 2021 book, Metamodernism, with a nod to Næss, but going beyond him. In the sense that Arne Næss first used it, a zetetic is a skeptical seeker of knowledge, a kind of intellectual agnostic, who, while seeking greater truths, is always wary of falsehood, and so doesn't claim to know the truth. Josephson Storm is right, though, I think, to resist this disavowal of knowledge as unnecessary, because it's perfectly coherent to say, I know there's a tree outside, but I could be wrong. Because this is just another way of saying that I have contingent situated reasons for provisionally thinking that there's a tree outside, or that I know that there's a tree outside. But this is not a claim to absolute or infallible knowledge. So Zateticism, as Josephson Storm defines it, represents a kind of humility towards knowledge. So as a Zatetic, I recognize that I can know many things, but that there's always the possibility that I might be wrong about anything, including on deep religious and metaphysical matters. To return to my religious identity, though, so I would say that I am Zatetically Christian, or a Christian Zatetic. I don't just mean this in an epistemological sense either, because it's existential, as much to do with my being embodied in the world as it has to do with my knowledge that, say, Jesus is divine in some sense. It's a pragmatic stance that links knowledge to its practical stakes for belief and action. So someone might say, Jesus is a divine being whom God resurrected from the dead. But so what? That doesn't make Christianity a clearly demarcated religion in competition with other religions, objectively and obviously true, whatever that means, much less that a particular form of Christianity, whether Protestant, Catholic, or Orthodox, is obviously and objectively true. But he's not just a divine being, the apologist might retort, but the second person of the Trinity, fully divine, fully human, with the natures distinct but not separate, inseparable but not confused. Sure, that's one way that predominantly Greek-speaking Christians defined the nature of the person of Jesus at a council in Chalcedon in the mid-5th century. But let's not arrogantly presume that this contingent situated attempt to make sense of the Christian revelation is final, definitive, and infallible, or that the very open, unsettled, infallible sacred text it is based upon is final, definitive, and infallible either. To be clear, I'm not thereby suggesting that there were not any good reasons at all for speaking of the union of Christ's humanity and divinity in one hypostasis or person. I just think that doctrinal disagreement on this Christological point, as well as earlier in the Trinitarian controversies in the 4th century, was taken way, way too seriously, to the point where eminent church fathers like Athanasius of Alexandria in the later 4th century declined to call a fellow Christian of a previous generation, Arius, a real Christian. And I also think that doctrinal disagreement is still taken way, way too seriously by Christians today, who continue to dogmatically insist that someone is not a Christian merely because they do not assent to a creed formed in the context of despotic Roman imperial power. I've often said that a Christian is as a Christian does. So a Christian is anyone, who identifies with, belongs to the crucified and risen Messiah, whose life began in the 1st century, but whose afterlife spread soon after his death, in the lives of those Jews, and later non-Jews, who followed his way or path. I also like to refer to the words of the great Universalist church father Gregory of Nyssa, who said in a couple of his ascetical works, like De Professione Christiana and De Perfectione, that Christianity is nothing other than, quote, an imitation, or in Greek, mimesis, of the divine nature, as revealed in Christ. According to Gregory, the best example of how to imitate Christ was the Apostle Paul, who desired only that Christ live in him. But Paul, though he claimed to be a special kind of apostle, which literally means a sent out one, to the non-Jewish nations, was a fallible follower of Jesus and his way, like all of us Christians are. So we should not comprehensively condemn Paul as the primary source of misogyny or homophobia, imperialism, colonialism, anti-Semitism, or even, most surprisingly to those who were a part of this early proto-communist movement, capitalism. But neither should we idolize Paul and his contingent situated words to early Christian assemblies, and fail to be attuned to the various ways in which Christians have appealed to him in support of these oppressive ideologies that I mentioned. In saying all this, there is a profound truth that Gregory of Nyssa points to when he appeals to the Apostle Paul's words in Galatians 2:20, which say, I have been crucified with Christ, yet it is not I who lives, but Christ who lives in me. It's a truth which the anonymous late 5th century Christian Platonist writer, who adopted the persona of a minor pagan character in the book of Acts called Dionysius, also recognized in his work on the divine names. Namely, that the divine eros, or love, is intrinsically ecstatic and literally stands outside itself, even as it remains within itself, and so bids us to go outside ourselves by loving God and neighbor, or we could say by loving God as one's neighbor, but without erasing our unique identities. Here's what Dionysius says after quoting the aforementioned words from Paul. Quote, "He says this to God as a true and ecstatic lover. He does not lead a life for himself, but he lives the life of a lover, a life which is exceedingly beloved." End quote. I hope to be a lover of humans, indeed of all life on this planet. But this does not mean that I uncritically affirm, accept, or agree with every person or ideology, or that I do not hate certain groups of people, or, to be more accurate, the ways in which certain groups of people are consumed by oppressive ideologies, or to use religious language, serve idols. When Jesus says in Luke's Gospel, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation," it is clear that he unequivocally condemns the rich, not because he has no love for them, but because they are a small, powerful group of people who systemically oppress the mass, powerless class of peasants in his day. So Jesus has what liberation theologians later called a preferential option for the poor, that is to say, a priority for the well-being of the poor and powerless over the rich and powerful. Now, if this political message is central to the gospel or good news of the kingdom of God Jesus proclaimed and practiced, and it undeniably is, then it ineluctably entails two things, I think. Firstly, that it means that, as Archbishop and martyr Oscar Romero put it, to love our neighbor means to be concerned about their needs, their concrete situation, and like the Good Samaritan, to help the poor fallen by the roadside. But secondly, it equally means that Christians, followers of Jesus, must condemn capitalists and oppose the intrinsically unjust ideology they're consumed by, which not only keeps the rich rich and the poor poor, but increasingly in our times makes the rich richer and the gap between them and those poorer than them even greater. There's a common unsourced popular saying in antiquity that the Church Father Jerome quotes approvingly in his works, which captures this intrinsic injustice well. He says, quote, "The rich person is either an unjust person themselves or the heir of one." So similarly, one can say that the capitalist is either an unjust person or the heir of one, not because the early church fathers were anachronistically anti-capitalists or that Jesus was a socialist, but because biblical and early church teachings acknowledge a symbiotic and parasitic relationship between two classes of people, which, when translated into today's context, refer to a similarly oppressive relationship between the small group of people who not only accumulate capital, but own and control the means of production, and the much larger group of people who are owned and controlled by the former group to work for them, giving them what's often called surplus value, to use the Marxist term, which basically means the excess of value produced by the labor of workers over the wages that they are paid. But to put this in simpler terms, so just as the rich are rich because of the greed of the rich to hoard more than their share of God's gift in Jesus' day, and the poor are poor because of their being exploited by the rich, so too we can say in the present day that modern day capitalists are powerful and wealthy because of their control and ownership of production and distribution in the market, and modern day laborers relatively powerless and destitute because of their being controlled and in some sense owned by the capitalist bosses. Now, I do not hate capitalists for who they are as human beings, but I certainly do hate them for who they are as in their role as capitalists. And of course, I also hate the actions, not just what they stand for. Now, this might sound like too strong language to certain centrists who just might want mummy and daddy to get along, so to speak. But I tend to think that this kind of dogmatic anti-rage stance is not only personally unhelpful and interpersonally complicit in injustices, but probably also reflects a kind of unresolved trauma. Because as Daniel Mate, the son of the prominent Canadian physician and writer Gabor Mate, has astutely pointed out in a fairly recent Jacobin interview, just as people on the right and left have their own traumas to process, there's a whole layer of trauma that you can see in so-called centrism these days that can be very blind to the genuine complaints and grievances of either side. To be sure, there are many forms of rage that are potentially destructive. For instance, there's a common trope by anti-socialists or anti-communists of socialists that sees them as driven by a kind of resentment rage that is both envious of and wants to enact revenge against the rich. This is not always an unjust charge, but in practice, it's often a crude stereotype. And anyway, it's irrelevant to the truth of their socioeconomic analysis. As George Orwell once noted in his work, The Road to Wigan Pier, he said, quote, "To recoil from socialism because so many socialists are inferior people is as absurd as refusing to travel by train because you dislike the ticket collector's face," end quote. The Canadian former professor and psychologist Jordan Peterson, who has for many years positioned himself as a classical liberal centrist, until more recently explicitly aligning himself with Ben Shapiro's right-wing propagandist media company, The Daily Wire, and his ilk, has once tried to appeal to this work of Orwell's in the preface to his first book in 1999, Maps Meaning. He said that reading this book undermined his claimed former socialist ideology, because in the essay that concluded that book, Orwell claimed, according to Peterson, that socialists did not really like the poor, they merely hated the rich. Their ideology served to mask resentment and hatred bred by failure. This is, of course, a visible, overgeneralized statement to make about a book that explicitly argues for socialism, not against it. But it does point to a real phenomenon where a person, a part of a less powerful group of people, can have a kind of reactive rage against all the members of a more powerful group of people. Like, for example, and just use a random example, like an Amazon worker who is angry at all capitalists in America, rather than just Jeff Bezos and his ilk. There's a truth to the Amazon's reactive rage, though, because she's right to see herself as a subject acted upon by more powerful people who really don't care for her interests. But it would be more justified for her to direct her rage at those specific people who are oppressing her, and more so the economic system which enables capitalists like Bezos to be ultra-billionaires. This would be a form of rage which is not only useful, but can lead to positive change. The African-American philosopher and anti-racist scholar Maisha Cherry, in her book The Case for Rage, calls this kind of rage Lordian rage. Lordian here referring to the work of Audre Lorde, the Black feminist poet and scholar. The goal of Lordian rage, Cherry says, is to absorb anger and use it for energy. As the title of Lorde's influential essay, The Uses of Anger, suggests, anger has its benefits. Lordian rage is useful if it is focused with precision and translated into needed action. It does not desire to harm or inflict pain, but only to fight injustice. So it's kind of an honest and more healthy kind of rage, acknowledging, on the one hand, the reality of one's own anger without being consumed by it. But since it is all too easy to become consumed by hatred towards certain types of people, we all, and I more than the others, as Emmanuel Levinas put it, quoting Dostoevsky, must combat this poisonous attitude with compassion and a deeply caring attitude, which is fundamental to Christian ethics, of course, but it's also a prominent theme in Mahayana Buddhism. Mahayana Buddhists, like all Buddhists for that matter, speak of four unsurpassable virtues. So you have karuna, which is a compassionate desire to alleviate the suffering of all sentient beings. Metta, which is the desire to bring well-being to all sentient beings. Mudita, which is a sympathetic joy for the achievement and success of others. And lastly, upekkha, or equanimity, which literally means an evenness of mind. So Shantideva, this famous Buddhist who wrote this 8th century masterpiece called the Bodhicharyavatara, or in English, the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, is someone who doesn't have much positive at all to say about anger. In fact, he calls the worst of all unhealthy states of mind. But his recommendation to eliminate anger by substituting it for compassion or karuna and loving kindness or metta is helpful advice, I think, because it can help prevent becoming consumed by anger. So karuna and metta are desirable to cultivate, not just because they can psychologically help us, but also because they are ethically better and metaphysically truer to our experience in the world. Or at least, and that's my experience. Because I think we often feel better and flourish all much better when we recognize that, as Shantideva says, quote, whatever transgressions and evil deeds of various kinds there are, all of them arise through the power of conditioning factors, while there is nothing that arises independently. So there are specific conditioning factors which explain, but not necessarily determine or justify, the social world. Like as I've referred to, like why capitalists are consumed by the noxious ideology of capitalism and so driven to become greedy, even if it goes against their more noble instincts. But there's also conditioning factors that can explain the way that the natural world is. Like why, especially since the mid-20th century, we have rapidly made this planet uninhabitable for both human and non-human life. So here we return to the eco part of what I was calling earlier my eco-socialist identity. For it so happens, or rather, it is no coincidence in my view, that the ecological crisis we are currently in, the climate crisis or emergency, biodiversity loss, land degradation, water pollution, and so on, is not due to we humans in the abstract, or we humans collectively having a greater impact on the natural environment compared to previous epochs, as the politically neutral term Anthropocene has suggests. It's both historically misleading and false, I think, to claim that all human beings are equally responsible for the climate crisis, for instance. As the economic anthropologist Jason Hickel put it in his 2021 book, Less is More, quote, it was only with the rise of capitalism over the past few hundred years and the breathtaking acceleration of industrialization from the 1950s that on a planetary scale, things began to tip out of balance. More specifically, as the Swedish ecologist Andreas Malm has persuasively argued in his 2016 book, Fossil Capital, a close study of the transition to a fossil fuel economy in early 19th century Britain shows the extent to which the historical origins of anthropogenic climate change were predicated on highly inequitable global processes from the start. So the reasons for investing in steam technology at the time were inextricably tied to the opportunities provided by the constellation of a largely depopulated New World, Afro-American slavery, the exploitation of British labor in factories and mines, and the global demand for inexpensive cotton cloth. After all, steam engines were not installed and controlled by anyone, but specifically the capitalist class, basically white British men who pointed steam power, both literally and metaphorically, as a weapon on sea and land, boats and rails, against the best part of humankind. from the Niger Delta to the Yangtze Delta to the Levant, from the Levant to the Latin America, which was the extent of the British Empire in the 19th century and a bit later into the 20th century. Because, at no moment did the species vote for the system or have any sort of shared authority over its own destiny and that of the Earth system. And later on, too, the succession of energy technologies following steam energy, electricity, later the internal combustion engine, the petroleum complex, basically cars, tankers, and planes. All of these also were introduced through investment decisions, sometimes with crucial input from certain governments, but really through democratic deliberation. It's true that, as the philosopher Stephen Best has said in a recent article, that humans have created hierarchical and growth-addicted societies and have demonstrated ecocidal proclivities before the emergence of capitalism. So I'm not saying that capitalism caused, strictly speaking, hierarchical and growth-addicted societies and ecocidal proclivities. But even as Best acknowledges, industrial capitalism, of all the disruptive effects of human activity, is undoubtedly the greatest. And so I think it's justified to call our age, not the Anthropocene, but the Capitalocene, as the American environmental historian Jason Moore has popularized the term, though apparently it originated with Andreas Malm in conversation with him. So I think capitalism is the pivot of today's biospheric crisis. As Jason Moore puts it, capitalism's political economy rests upon an audacious accumulation strategy, which he summarizes using the phrase cheap nature. For capitalists and capitalists, nature is cheap in a double sense. Nature's elements are cheap in price, for one, but also everything's cheapened and degraded or made inferior, the better to make nature cheap in price. The underlying problem here, though, I think, is the idea that our histories can be told by adding up humanity or society with nature. It may sound cliched among scholars to denounce dualisms, but the categories of society versus nature are surely a part of the problem that has made the biosphere progressively uninhabitable. For as soon as you abstractly objectify both nature on the one hand and ourselves as a species, and then put them against each other, I think we can begin to reify them. That is to say, turn nature into a thing for use and turn the human in society as things for our use. The astonishing thing is that it took until the 1970s for scholars like Arne Næss, who I mentioned earlier, to begin to recognize that doing social history, the history of humans as society, in isolation from the history of the natural world, is not only methodologically flawed, but itself socially destructive. But thankfully thereafter, there developed a more relational, interdependent view of humanity in nature, and nature and humanity, which gained dominance in the burgeoning field of environmental studies. And so this is how we get back from a long digression back to the term eco-socialism, which is a combinatory term which, though it has theoretical and practical roots in the late 80s and early 90s, it became popularized following a 2001 eco-socialist manifesto by Michael Levy, a French scholar, and Joel Koval. So back in the early 2000s, eco-socialism was not yet a spectre, nor was it grounded in any concrete party or movement. It was only, Levy and Koval said, quote, a line of reasoning based on a reading of the present crisis and the necessary conditions for overcoming it, end quote. Their manifesto in 2001, like many before it, was of course in conscious dialogue with the original manifesto, the Communist Manifesto. But unlike Marx and Engels, they lacked a movement with which to associate their ideas. they were left to wonder whether the spectre of eco-socialism could be brought into being, to use the phrase from the Communist Manifesto. In the 2 decades since, a lot has changed, of course. As the writer for Jacobin and climate activist Sam Knights has put it in a review of a recent eco-socialist book, quote, "Many more people have died as a result of ecological destruction. Many more species have been rendered extinct. The climate crisis has intensified, and people in the global north are beginning to realize what people in the global south have been saying for centuries. It is time to fight back." From Occupy Wall Street and striking school children to various Green New Dealers and the network of worker cooperatives and supporting institutions fighting to build a solidarity economy in Mississippi and beyond, often known as Corporation Jackson. Westerners in core capitalist countries are at least increasingly aware of systemic issues with capitalism and its links to the global ecological crisis, even as strongmen, authoritarian, nationalist, populist leaders in the Americas, the Middle East, pockets all over Europe, and Russia have had a corrosive impact on the liberal democratic tradition, especially since Putin's rise to power at the turn of the 20th century. As the American scholar of fascism Ruth Ben-Ghiat has chronicled in a 2020 book on strongmen. At a scholarly level as well, there's a lot of, there's dozens of books and articles now on the topic of eco-socialism. Just last year in 2022, I just saw recently that there's even a Routledge handbook to its name, which I'll refer to in later detail and later videos, probably. Yeah, and of course there's also more in non-English languages that I could refer to, but since most of my viewers are English speakers, and so I won't burden you with references to Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and French names and works, to just stick with the Latinate languages that I know, either minimally or proficiently, though I will refer later to eco-socialist movements in Latin America, because they are, among the most prominent ones, which are building momentum from which I think we can gain a lot of inspiration. But just to give you just a succinct summary of what is eco-socialism, I'm just going to quote from the introduction to that Routledge companion I mentioned earlier. So this is a fairly long scholarly definition, but I'm just going to quote it. So eco-socialism, briefly put, is a movement, a perspective, a practice, and in some cases an institutional politics that gathers together socialist and ecological principles and objectives. It is socialist in the sense of identifying capitalist relations as the ultimate and systemic cause of structural inequalities and environmental destruction. Politically, this means struggling for social equality by establishing social control over the means of life and ending all forms of exploitation of nature, which includes people. This struggle embraces decolonization and cross-generational justice, as well as overcoming the gendered and racialized class hierarchies that capitalism depends on for the exploitation of the unwaged majority of the world's people, notably women. It means developing respect for differing knowledge systems, striving to combine them to the benefit of all. Eco-socialism is environmentalist, on the other hand, in calling attention to the biophysically destructive character of currently conventional power relations and the imposed ways of living. Eco-socialism premises the understanding of biophysical processes on diverse forms of systematic knowledge and inquiry, institutional and otherwise. Eco-socialism, in other words, stands for the development of ecologically sane, egalitarian communities worldwide. Now, there's a lot in that scholarly summary that needs to be unpacked, but since this introductory video has already been much longer than I anticipated, I'll do so in a later video instead, and with a common unsourced Maori whakatauki or proverb that succinctly expresses why ecological and socialist ideas and practices, I think, must go together. So so it goes, manaki whenua, manaki tangata, haere whakamua. which translates into English roughly as care for the land, care for the people, move forward. So basically what that whakatauki is expressing is that manaaki whenua, or care for the land, is not possible if we don't have manaaki tangata, or care for the people. And conversely, manaaki tangata, or care for the people, is not possible if we don't have manaaki whenua, care for the land.